I'm going to be talking a little bit today about the projects that we've been doing at the Institute of Physics over many years now. The IOP has been working on diversity projects for over 15 years, and so I'm going to try and summarise our findings of that in about 5 minutes. So please bear with me. It's going to be a pretty whirlwind discussion. So, a lot of you, I'm sure, are well aware of the issues in science and especially in physics in terms of diversity. But just to outline these a little bit and to draw attention to a few of the facts, our 2018 report, Why Not Physics, found that although girls perform just as well as boys, they only make up 21% of those students actually sitting A-level physics. And that's not budged really for quite a few years now. 68% of schools send less than 2 girls on to A-level physics, compared to 28% of boys. And 65% of girls have physics in their top 4 grades at GCSE with a 8% progression rate. And you can compare this to 25 and 32% for chemistry and biology, respectively. So you can see here that there's a huge discrepancy in terms of gender. And it's at a school level, but it's also within the subjects if you compare physics to biology and chemistry. So as I said, the Institute of Physics has been working for a long time on these, on gender in particular, and these are some of our reports that you can find on our website. And I'm just going to summarise some of the key findings and things that we found out over the years. So importantly, physics is not the only subject with a serious gender imbalance. This is seen across many subjects across the school. There's only a couple subjects that tend to not have much of a gender imbalance. Schools which beat the odds for physics do so for other gendered subjects. So if, for example, there's a gender imbalance in physics, there is very little gender imbalance in physics, there is probably a very little gender imbalance in English in terms of the numbers of boys choosing English as a subject. Physics is seen as an academic pathway and is viewed as a hard and difficult and elite subject by many. Social conditioning of boys and girls as oppositional, which starts early, is detrimental in terms of the choices they make. And there are circumstances where girls do progress in greater numbers, for example, in single-sex schools, but there is limited research on this, so we need to be a bit cautious when, discussing that. Loads of great work is often done in the physics department, in the science department, but this can be completely undermined if the message isn't consistent across the whole school. So you might hear in other subjects, or students might hear at home about physics or science being difficult, that it's a boy subject, those sorts of things. So it very much needs to be a whole school initiative. Girls are more positively impacted by having a specialist teacher. Obviously in physics, so physics specialists teaching their subject seems to have a positive impact, more so for girls than for boys. Advice on jobs that is timely, impartial and tailored, and crucially involves parents and carers, is really important in terms of making students aware of the jobs that are available for them from physics. And inclusive teaching is vital. Bias exists everywhere. It's often unintentional, but it exists in the school community and it exists more widely. So this is a graph on one of our projects. This was a pilot a few years ago now called the Drayson Pilot Programme. And we saw a tripling in the number of girls choosing to take A-level physics. Now, this was a very small study. It was only 6 schools. So although this was exciting, we need to know whether this is something that can be replicated on a larger scale. And I'm going to give you a little bit of information about what has happened since. So based on the pilot, the Improving Gender Balance and Pearson pilot programs, we have an Improving Gender Balance randomised controlled trial. We're funded by the DFE and externally evaluated by the Institute of Education. It's a 3-year trial, and we currently have 160 schools that have been recruited across England. Half of those schools have been randomly allocated to the control, that's business as usual, normal school life, and half to intervention, which means support from an IGB coach from the Institute of Physics. And based on the findings of the Pearson pilot, we're focusing on 6 key areas of school life. So personal practice, this is talking about inclusive teaching techniques, science and subject capital. There's curriculum and learning, which is all about physics teaching at Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 and 5, working with non-specialists and specialists of physics. Progression, choices and jobs. This is supporting schools with a message about jobs from physics. Student voice. This is listening to what young people have to say and using them as a lever for change in a school. It's also about making young people the experts in physics and giving ownership of the subject to them where possible. Engagement with parents, carers and the wider school community, including governors, especially around jobs and opportunities from STEM. And looking at how internal and external communications can be made more inclusive, particularly in the messaging around physics, trying to make sure those negative messages don't get out there. In the same way as the pilot study, the IGB trial is bespoke to the needs of each individual schools, and we feel that's really important, to really listen to what schools are saying and what their needs are, rather than trying to put a project on a school. And to make a difference, we really need to move from talking about encouraging girls to take physics, to removing the barriers to subject choice more broadly. Young people themselves are not responsible for the lack of diversity in physics. Girls are not a homogenous group, and we need to listen, understand, and remove the barriers that exist for them. As a society, we need to challenge the idea that physics is for the naturally gifted and only for those that are considered brainy. We also need to accept and understand that biases and stereotypes affecting subject choice do exist, and we need to challenge that. In practical terms, we need to see that this is a long-term change in culture. One-off events, one-off initiatives, probably have a very limited impact. It needs to be a long-term change to make a real difference. And this is everyone's responsibility, both within the school and within the wider education community. And this is why we really welcome the effort Pearson is making for change here and enabling a conversation to take place. So the Institute of Physics, what are we doing? So 2020 saw the launch of the Institute of Physics' new strategic phase. This is what will guide and steer our work over the next 5 years. And this brief introduction has focused on Challenge 1. Now you can see there, diversity and skills, which says we want to build a thriving, diverse physics community and play our part in solving the STEM skills shortage by ensuring that young people, no matter their background or where they live, have access to world-class physics education and training. This is a large but really pressing and urgent issue. This work will see us as an organisation spark an influencing campaign with key players to lead the physics community to being more diverse. In particular, we would like to really focus on the following groups of people, and certainly groups that haven't been involved very much in the past in projects. So, for example, disabled younger people, Black Caribbean younger people, those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, of course, carrying on with the work on with girls. And of course, this is all intersectional. Our campaign is currently taking shape, and there's a role for all of us to make science truly representative of wider society. Thank you for listening to this introduction on the work from the Institute of Physics.
Thank you, Jess. Fantastic. I mean, I couldn't agree more that we need to look at the whole system. I think that the idea that you can just change how we approach science in schools without changing the perception of whether English is for boys, arts are for boys, whether PE is for girls, all of those things. Totally agree. It needs to be part of that whole, certainly. And I do think that sort of whole is made up of multiple elements. I'm really interested in the idea around girls being more positively impacted by a physics specialist. I wonder whether some of that might just be because that physics specialist might be someone in whom they can see themselves enjoying and being and excelling at physics. So I do think this issue of role models is within that wider whole really important. So we're looking to turn this out then to our panelists. What kind of approaches to bringing in those role models in a kind of systemic way can you think of that you've seen work effectively? Henna, can we hear from you?
Yeah, sure. So this isn't necessarily an answer to the question. It's more of an observation, really. But so I've got a 3-year-old, and she came home from nursery one day saying all these sorts of things like, farmers have to be boys and pilots must be boys, they can't be girls. And it's amazing how early these sorts of biases and these sorts of things start to come in. And it just really surprised me that we do so much work at kind of key stage 3, key stage 4, higher up when teachers and students are older. But actually, there's something that we need to, I think, start doing and start focusing on a lot lower down, because those sorts of ideas. I mean, it took me a while to convince her that actually, no, you can do whatever you want. You can be a pilot as well if you want to, and it's not it's not kind of gender specific roles for specific jobs. And I think having those sorts of conversations and just being aware of it, really, because a lot of it is probably things that people are not aware of when they talk about it, because you're unaware of your own unconscious bias. But I think just sort of starting to maybe focus, there might be work that's already done out there, but just a bit more of a focus on those sorts of things at not just primary but nursery level, and then we can kind of build up from there.
Absolutely. Mary, did you want to come back on that?
Yes, I wanted to follow up on what Henna said, which is, she says her comment is anecdotal, but we know from the work that Louise Archer and her team have done about Science Capital that those ideas about role models and attitudes start very, very early. So our primary team are working with teachers' professional development, looking at what role models you can use as early as nursery. And we have STEM Ambassador Programme, which is people from industry and research can volunteer and go into school and work with a group of students. But picking up on what Jess said, thinking about how those role models are used in schools and moving away from something like a one-off event, and also particularly, we find teachers quite often say, the starting point is, could somebody come and give a talk? Or the STEM ambassadors say, can we come and give a talk? And so trying to move to thinking about not just getting role models into school, but how they are used is really key, I think. So there's the age range thing and being aware, go younger, start with nursery, but don't forget about kids in year 9 making career choices, subject choices. So, but also thinking about the way this role models interact. So thinking about, can a STEM ambassador do something like instigate or work with something like a mini research project the students are doing and go in over a period of time and perhaps act as somebody who makes suggestions about equipment or approaches, or maybe does some evaluation towards the end of the project about who's, which things have been successful.
Absolutely, that sort of sustained engagement is likely to be much more meaningful. Adil, could you feed in on that point, please?
Yeah, so I've worked in sort of very challenging schools, and one of the issues we had quite a bit, particularly at A level, was the lack of uptake from girls, which is not uncommon. However, where we started to see a real difference was having a female physics teacher, which, we talk about role models, and having a female physics teacher massively improved our uptake of girls in physics. So, I completely agree with the idea that, if we have role models, it should be sustained over a period of time. So I suppose one of the things I come back to is, in terms of teacher training, is there a reason why we don't have as many female physics teachers, or is there something we can do further to sort of enhance subject knowledge that will allow those role models to be seen day in, day out by students, and therefore make them more aspirational and want to do physics at the higher level?
Absolutely. Yes, that's a really good point. Penny, could I bring you on, please?
Hi, just picking up on what Mary talked about in terms of how we really bring role models to the forefront for young people. We do a lot of work with industry, and how we integrate is kind of getting role models to be mentors on projects alongside teachers. So it's very much about using different people within businesses who are willing and able to do that, to be able to talk to the young people about a project they're working on, but also bring in the softer skills element, the teamwork, the communication, and understanding what a workplace might look like. And I think it's really important in discussions like this to kind of take into account that not everybody wants to be a role model or a mentor from a business, and actually we need to be able to support them in doing that, in terms of actually standing up and talking to a business audience might be one thing, but talking to primary or secondary young people might be more of a challenge. So if we can support both sides, it could be that we really link together, and just having that breadth. So actually it has to be about these people that young people might look to and say, that could be me, I could do that in the future, and just how we really make that connection, whatever route, whatever subject area, and as Mary said, from an early age, is so important.
That's a really good point. I in my work do quite a lot of speaking to parliamentarians and some fairly senior officials. I also do a bit of work with school children. You can probably guess which is the most intimidating. Pale, can I bring you in at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Mary and Penny were saying in terms of the importance of role models. And at Women in Data, we did some research a while ago, because, maths and sciences are so interlinked in terms of, some of the skill sets. But actually what we found when we started talking to boys and girls is that boys thought maths and science was sociable and collaborative. 71% of boys said that, whereas girls, it was 43%. And, there's this huge part of perception around, what is fun and collaborative. And like I said in my intro, I'm kind of a mathematician, and I've worked in the banking industry in that aspect, but it's been brilliant fun in that it's problem solving. And this is where role models really have a part to play, to bring it to life in terms of what you're doing with your science and math skills to then help solve challenges and problems. And I think it's the art of storytelling that helps kids to really start to feel what it's like, rather than have their perception of what they think it's going to be like, when they start working in a physics environment, once they kind of grow up. And what we found as well is that for boys and girls that follow role models, the stats are amazing in that they're 5 times more likely to become a CEO, 7 times more likely to become C-suite. And so it's really important that we kind of enhance the accessibility of some of these role models to really get them to connect with, the next generation. And, I think, Adil, to your point, there is a lack of, female physicians or scientists. But I think we need to be creative in who we look to then be the role models. And actually, everyone is a role model to someone. So someone doing A-levels is a role model to GCSE people. And so I think we really need to kind of think outside the box as to who we view in that community.
Yes, a lot of the research does say that the nearer a peer a person is to you, the more likely they are to be seen as a valid role model by the person who's looking up to them. I'm going to sort of slightly switch track of this conversation a little, just to the question of our sort of historical role models within the sort of the science curriculum. So obviously the individuals, the people that we bring students into contact with is one part of it, but there's also the question of who they're seeing represented throughout the curriculum they're learning from. What does the panel have any sort of thoughts about that issue? How do we, who do we use as role models in that respect? How do we address some of those quite complex and potentially difficult issues around that? Emma, could I bring you in?
We've actually been on this journey for just over a year now through our work in developing our curriculum, and this is one of the things we looked at initially, was sort of auditing who our young people see in terms of who we talk about in our curriculum. I am a female physics teacher, and so I came from a slightly non-neutral viewpoint in terms of the work the IOP had done, and so initially it was about gender. We were looking at gender, but obviously that conversation has changed because we also recognise that we need to talk about other protective characteristics as well. So we started off by auditing and looking at who we were talking about. Now, we can't change who we talk about because the scientific revolution was predominantly delivered through white men, and that is our reality, and we have to talk about that, and their discoveries were extraordinary and need to be acknowledged. But we also need to think about what else we build around that, what context we tell young people in terms of why that was the case, in terms of the social factors at the time, but also then look at who we're representing in the hinterland, the additional knowledge that we share with them, and talking about different people's narratives within that. And so once you go past that initial audit, you need to have open conversations with your teachers, your communities about those people, particularly problematic people who have views and are sharing views that are perhaps not in line with our views and are not inclusive of our communities. And are we unwittingly perpetuating stereotypes, and are we using the right language when we talk about particularly ideas within science? So for us, it was a lot about facilitating those conversations with our teams, hearing our experiences, and then going out into the wider community to find out more, and then reflecting again and coming back to it. So it's quite a process and it's quite a journey, and that does involve role models. It does involve having more representation within your curriculum, but it's also about talking about why the people we have are there, but why they look the way they do, and perhaps why they might say some of the things they said.
That's a really really good way to describe it. I do think there's potentially a strength to be offered to science teaching here of placing things in their context. I mean, something I found out probably a little too recently was that Ronald Fisher, who designed Fisher's t-test, one of the most sort of widely used tests of statistical significance, designed it in order to use it within his work in eugenics. And this is someone who actually went to the same university that I did. So it's sort of that history isn't widely known. It places a lot of not just the people who did science, but the perspective they brought to science in context. And I think it's important for us to ensure that young people understand this. And I think understanding how this the scientific world has come about will probably help them to feel like it's something they need to engage with to improve in some ways, I suspect. Pale.
I was going to just say that, of course, we can't change history in terms of, the amazing role models that we all kind of grown up and read about. But I think there are some incredible people and talent that are in the industry today. And I think, we should really elevate and talk about their stories as to how they've got there. We can all look at, Florence Nightingale or, whoever to think about, what they did as big pioneering initiatives. But that there's so much talent in the industry working in all sorts of sectors, actually, because that's the wonderful thing about science, is that, in your mind, maybe you have the stereotype of, do you work in a laboratory? But actually, there's so much you can be doing, like working in Formula One and thinking about engines. So I really think it's important that we're creative in who we look to tell their story, but it's kind of just bringing the generations a little bit closer, I think, is really important to inspire kids today.
Brilliant. I'm just going to turn to Ade now, and then we'll move on to get a bit deeper into the questions around outreach.
Hopefully my audio is okay now. Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay, fabulous. Really just to echo some of what Emma and Pyle have been saying, which is that very often it's about context for young people, especially when you're talking about role modeling. Being able to see people as human and recognizing the influence of that humanness on their decision making, why they did what they did, and actually it's about critical thinking as well for students, recognizing that when they're looking at a scientific paradigm, or they're looking at a particular theory or approach, that was influenced by the perspective of the person who actually implemented that, and it just gives them a much more human feel to science, which, as you all pointed out, can seem quite alien to young people. And I love what you were saying, Payal, about the contemporariness of science. Science is ever evolving, it's ever changing. There's new ideas, great things happening, and we should be focusing more on more contemporary examples and role models and how they managed to get to where they got to actually support students to understand that. And just one more point with regards to Emma's point about, we can't change the people that came forward with all of these ideas. But even though we can't do that, we can recognize, as you said, the context in which they did that, and the fact that they would have had people who they worked with, who were in the background, who perhaps did the actual work involved in coming up with these ideas, who just weren't recognized. And adding that as well to the mix to say, yeah, this person came up with this great idea, but did they? Who else was there who actually informed the development of that idea? I think all of those conversations are great for young people to engage in and actually make science a lot more real, I think, in that sense.
Absolutely. I think that point around the contemporariness of role models, what are we doing to seek out those contemporary role models? We all know Einstein, sure, but like the people who are making these fantastic discoveries now probably won't be such household names. What can we do to bring them into the forefront? It's an interesting issue. Henna has made a brief plea to talk about some of what Pearson are doing in science resources. So let's turn to her, and then we'll go to you, Penny, for a case study on outreach.
I'll be really quick, I promise, Andrew. I just wanted to pick up on what Pyle, Emma and Ade were saying about having not only historical role models, but also having those conversations about why it was those particular people in history that maybe were not as diverse, and making sure that we equip teachers to be able to have those conversations with students. So, and I think that's the key thing, because if you're not, I know what science teachers are like, I am one, but if you're not sure about something, then you kind of don't really want to go too near the conversation, because it's a little bit uncomfortable. You're a little bit unsure about how to talk about how to emphasize that content. So I think that's why in what we're trying to do with the science education and in the curriculum that we're currently working on is embedding all of these in the curriculum teaching at GCSE and at Key Stage 3. So we're trying to look at how we can embed these role models, how we can make sure it is part of day-to-day teaching. So it's not an extra, it's not an aside, but it's kind of it's integrated into the teaching. So if you're talking about a role model, why is it that role model, as you were saying, Adi? Are there other people that we can talk about as well? Are there more current people that are doing exciting things at the moment in science? Can we link that in? And that's what we're looking at integrating into the curriculum. So it's just really interesting that this is what everyone's talking about, and it's great that we're kind of already starting to try and embed those as well.